In the autumn of 1888, a schoolteacher named Ora Emery walked out of a one-room schoolhouse in rural Ohio and never went back. She had been teaching for 11 years. She was regarded, by every account available in the Hardin County Historical Record, as the most effective teacher in her district. A woman who had produced more students who went on to university than any other instructor in the county's history. She did not leave because she was dismissed. She did not leave because she was ill. She left because she had attended 3 weeks earlier a conference in Columbus organized by the newly formed National Education Association, at which a speaker from the Prussian-trained administrative reform movement, a man named William Torrey Harris, who was then the United States Commissioner of Education, had delivered an address that she later described, in a letter to her sister, as the most honest thing I have ever heard a government official say, and the most frightening. In that address, Harris told the assembled teachers that the purpose of the American Common School was not, and had never been, the development of individual thought. It was, in his words, the subsumption of the individual will into the social will. He said this not as a criticism. He said it as a program description. Ora Emery wrote it down verbatim. She went home. She wrote her letter. She resigned the following Monday. She spent the remaining 40 years of her life teaching private students in her kitchen, charging no fees to families who could not pay. The letter she wrote to her sister was preserved by that sister's descendants and donated to the Hardin County Historical Society in 1952. It has never been cited in any published history of American education. William Torrey Harris was the United States Commissioner of Education from 1889 to 1906. He was not a fringe figure. He was not a dissident voice. He was the official head of the federal office responsible for shaping the national education system, and he said to a room full of teachers in 1888 that the school's job was to subsume the individual will. That statement was not recorded in the official proceedings of the conference. It was recorded in a letter by a woman who resigned her career because of it. These are not the same thing, and the difference between them is the story this video is about. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research, unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what William Torrey Harris meant in 1888, and why his meaning was never entered into the official record, you have to go back not just a few decades. You have to go back to 1843, the year a Massachusetts politician and education reformer named Horace Mann returned from an 18-month tour of Prussia and published a report that would restructure American schooling for the next 150 years. Mann is presented in every standard history of American education as a hero, the father of the common school, the man who democratized learning. That account is not wrong about what he built. It is wrong about what he was building it for. Mann's 7th annual report to the Massachusetts Board of Education, published in 1843 and still available in full through the Massachusetts State Archives, runs to more than 300 pages. The sections that are quoted in history textbooks describe the virtues of universal schooling, literacy, civic participation, the elevation of the working poor. Those sections are real. What the textbooks do not quote, and what no teacher training program in this country has made standard reading, is the section in which Mann describes, with evident admiration, the feature of the Prussian system he most wished to import. It was not the curriculum. It was not the teacher training. It was what he called the habit of subordination. He used that phrase 6 times in 40 pages. The habit of subordination. The trained inclination to defer, to comply, to receive instruction without questioning its authority. Mann did not want to educate Americans. He wanted to habituate them. The Prussian school system that Mann admired had been designed explicitly after Prussia's catastrophic military defeat by Napoleon at the Battle of Jena in 1806. The Prussian state, humiliated and partially occupied, convened a commission of administrators and philosophers, among them Johann Gottlieb Fichte, whose addresses to the German nation were delivered in Berlin between 1807 and 1808 and published in full the following year, to determine how a nation could be rebuilt so that it would never again produce soldiers who thought for themselves at the wrong moment. Fichte's answer was schools. Compulsory schools. Schools that began early, ended late, divided time into rigid intervals, rewarded compliance, and made independent thought structurally difficult by ensuring that every hour was accounted for. In his sixth address, Fichte wrote with unusual candor that the new education must destroy freedom of will in the student, replacing it with a trained disposition to act as directed. He did not consider this a corruption of education. He considered it its highest function. The goal was not ignorance. The goal was something far more sophisticated than ignorance. A population literate enough to follow written orders, numerate enough to operate industrial machinery, and habituated, at the level of reflex, to deference. Horace Mann read Fichte. He toured the schools Fichte's ideas had built. He observed Prussian classrooms in which children sat in rows, answered only when called upon, and were assessed not on what they thought, but on whether they had correctly received what they had been given. He came home and wrote 300 pages recommending it for American children. This is not a theory. The documents exist. Mann's report is in the Massachusetts State Archives. Fichte's addresses were published in 1808 and have been continuously in print for more than 2 centuries. Harris's position and his stated views are a matter of public record. The Nee Committee's 1913 document is available at the Library of Congress. The connection between the Prussian military reform agenda and the American Common School movement is documented across all of them. It is simply not discussed in a way that makes it easy for the general public to encounter all 4 at once, in sequence, and recognize what they describe collectively. That is not an accident. A system designed to manage what people think about is not going to advertise the documents that explain how it was built. Before we move forward, if this is the kind of investigation that matters to you, subscribe and ring the bell. We cover buried histories every week. If you've ever sat in a classroom and felt that something about the arrangement was designed for you to receive and not to question, you belong here. Mann's 1843 report did not immediately transform American schooling. That transformation happened across 40 years, through a network of institutional actors who understood the program even when they did not state it as plainly as Harris would in 1888. The key figures in that 40-year transformation shared a specific characteristic. They were not educators by formation. They were administrators, economists, and industrialists who had identified correctly that a national education system was the most efficient mechanism ever devised for shaping the values, expectations, and behavioral reflexes of an entire population simultaneously. You could not reach every American adult, but you could reach every American child for 12 years, for 6 hours a day, in a structure you controlled. What Harris understood in 1888, what he said plainly to a room full of teachers, was that this was not an accidental feature of mass schooling. It was the point. Harris was not alone in his directness. In 1906, the year Harris retired as Commissioner of Education, a former president of Harvard named Charles W. Eliot, who chaired the influential Committee of 10 that had standardized the American high school curriculum, published an essay in which he argued that the purpose of secondary education was to fit students to their probable destination in the social order, not their highest potential. their probable destination. The essay was published in the Harvard Graduates magazine. It was read by the same network of administrators, foundation officers, and government officials who had been building the system for 60 years. It did not cause a scandal. It did not prompt a congressional inquiry. It was filed away, cited occasionally in academic footnotes, and left to sit in a periodical archive that almost no one reads. But the figure whose fingerprints are most directly on the physical structure of the American school day, on the bells, the timed intervals, the discrete subject periods that have defined every classroom in this country for more than a century, is one whose name does not appear in any standard history of education at all. His name was Frederick Taylor. Taylor is known, in the history of management, as the father of scientific management, the man who in 1911 published a book called The Principles of Scientific Management that described how industrial processes could be made maximally efficient by breaking work into discrete, measurable, repeatable units, and removing all discretionary judgment from the worker. You do not need to understand the whole task. You need to perform your part of it correctly and on schedule. The worker who understands only his portion cannot question the design of the machine he serves, because he cannot see it. Taylor considered this a feature, not a limitation. His book was an immediate sensation in American business, adopted by steel mills, textile factories, and railroads within 2 years of publication. Henry Ford cited it. The War Department cited it. And then, in a connection that the standard history of both management theory and education reform conspicuously omits, the National Education Association cited it. A 1913 report by the National Education Association's Committee on Economy of Time in Education, a 200-page document available at the Library of Congress, stamped with the NEA's official seal and presented to Congress as a framework for national curriculum reform, explicitly named Taylor's principles as the organizational model for the redesigned school day. The committee did not use Taylor as an analogy. It used him as a blueprint. Discrete subjects, timed intervals, standardized assessment, no subject allowed to bleed into another, no student permitted to pursue a line of inquiry past the allotted period, because an inquiry that crosses subject boundaries is an inquiry that cannot be standardized, and an inquiry that cannot be standardized cannot be controlled. The committee was not composed of fringe figures. It was composed of sitting school superintendents, university presidents, and a representative of the United States Bureau of Education. They cited Frederick Taylor by name in a federal curriculum document and recommended that the American school day be organized on the explicit model of a factory floor, not metaphorically. By citation. New York, 1843, Horace Mann publishes his report recommending Prussian subordination habits for American schools. Columbus, 1888, William Torrey Harris tells teachers that the school's function is subsumption of the individual will. Washington, 1913, the National Education Association formally adopts Frederick Taylor's factory management model for the school day. This is not coincidence. This is a program. And it ran for 70 years before a single mainstream historian thought to describe it as such. The standard history of American education has never adequately addressed several specific questions. It has never explained why Horace Mann's phrase, the habit of subordination, used 6 times in his foundational report, does not appear in any teacher training curriculum in the country. It has never explained why William Torrey Harris's 1888 address to the National Education Association was not entered into the official proceedings of that conference, despite Harris being the sitting United States Commissioner of Education. It has never explained why a 1913 federal curriculum report explicitly modeled the school day on Frederick Taylor's factory management principles, and why that citation was quietly dropped from every subsequent reprinting and summary of the committee's work. Why did the most powerful education reformer of the 19th century describe his goal not as learning, but as the habit of subordination? And why has that phrase never been made required reading in a single American teacher training program? Why does the official history of Horace Mann present a reformer who fought for working-class children while omitting the 18 months he spent admiring a system specifically designed to prevent soldiers from thinking for themselves? Why would a federal curriculum committee in 1913 cite an industrial management theorist by name? And why would every subsequent summary of that committee's work remove the citation? That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. But here is what makes this pattern different from every other account of institutional suppression. Different from the sealed corridors and the buried archives and the terminated researchers. This suppression did not happen in a basement. It happened in a classroom. It happened to you. Anyone over the age of 50 who is watching this video spent 12 years, at minimum, inside a system whose architects described its purpose in terms they were careful never to put on the report card. You were not told the goal. You were habituated to it. The habit of subordination does not announce itself. It presents as a curriculum. It presents as a bell schedule. It presents as the experience of raising your hand and waiting to be called on, and learning, over 12 years, that knowledge is something dispensed from the front of the room rather than something generated by the person sitting in the chair. Consider what a 12-year habituation actually produces in a person. 12 years of a bell telling you when to move. 12 years of a grade telling you whether your thinking was acceptable. 12 years of a curriculum that was designed, by committee, to cover exactly what the committee decided you needed to know, and to stop precisely where the committee decided you did not. A child who enters that system at age 5 and exits it at 17 has spent more waking hours being shaped by it than by any other single force in their life. They have been trained not by cruelty in most cases, but by structure. By a structure whose designers said plainly in 1843 and 1888 and 1913 what they were designing it to produce. Ora Emery understood this in 1888. She walked out of her schoolhouse and spent the rest of her life doing something different. Most of the people who should have understood it were already inside the system, already habituated, already past the point where the structure felt like a structure rather than simply the way things are. The school system that Harris described in 1888 and that Taylor's model reorganized in 1913 is still running. The bell still rings on the same schedule. The subjects are still discrete and timed. The assessment is still standardized. The report card still measures compliance with the system's own criteria that were designed by people who said so in documents that are available to anyone willing to read them, to produce a specific kind of person. Not a curious person, not an independently thinking person. A person with, in Horace Mann's exact words from his 1843 foundational report, the habit of subordination. The official history of American education tells us that schools were built to liberate the working class through literacy and civic knowledge. That story is not entirely false. Individual teachers, most of them, across most of that history, entered classrooms with genuine devotion and produced genuine learning. Ora Emery was one of them for 11 years before she understood the structure she was working inside. The teachers are not the story. The structure is the story. And the structure was built by people who said, in documents that have always been available, that liberation was not the design specification. The design specification was the managed production of a workforce that would be capable enough to be useful and conditioned enough not to ask who the system was useful to. Horace Mann said habit of subordination. Harris said subsumption of the individual will. Taylor said remove discretionary judgment from the worker. They were describing the same outcome from 3 different angles across 70 years. And the outcome they were describing is the person who sits down when the bell rings, stops when the bell rings again, and has spent 12 years learning that the questions worth asking are the ones the curriculum has already prepared an answer for. These records survive because people refuse to stop asking. If you've made it this far, you're already asking the question the system was designed to prevent. Subscribe and share this with someone who spent 12 years in a classroom and never once heard the name Horace Mann used in the same sentence as Johann Gottlieb Fichte. They deserve to know the connection. The documents have always been there. No one was told to look. Next week, I'm following a single line in a 1902 Rockefeller General Education Board memo that describes the purpose of public education in terms that make William Torrey Harris sound restrained. The memo was not classified. It was not sealed. It was filed in the open records of a public charitable foundation, and it has sat there for 120 years waiting for someone to read it carefully. The line is 11 words long. It was written by the same foundation that gave more money to shape American education between 1902 and 1920 than the federal government did. 11 words. You won't want to miss it.